We are here to talk about inclusion and accessibility in publishing and literature and how the two areas work with each other, kind of piggyback off each other, and we're going to talk about our experiences, where we've been, what we would like to see change, and some actionable tips on how we can make that happen. So if everyone would like to do introductions, go ahead and introduce yourself, what you do.
Great, I'll start because my square is right next to Courtney's in the Brady Bunch square. My name is Kishonna Gray. I'm a writer and editor out of Southern California. I'm a columnist at the Writer magazine, where I pen the column from the front lines about the art of publishing and the craft of writing. I am also the author of 2 books, one of which is a memoir that just came out. It's called Pinups. And I teach in the Master of Fine Arts program at Bay Path and Southern New Hampshire universities. I've also worked in the fields of literary magazine publishing. I'm a volunteer in the humanitarian sector and have been for over a decade now. So my expertise is relatively broad-ranging, and I've recently acquired a certificate in the art of diversity and inclusion. Thank you very much for having me.
I'll go next. My name is Dolly Chugh, and I'm a professor at the New York University Stern School of Business. I'm in the department called Management and Organizations, so I teach courses in things like leadership, management, and negotiations. And my research focuses on what I call the psychology of good people. I'm a social psychologist, and I'm interested in the ways in which our behavior doesn't always live up to our intentions or our conscious intentions. My first book is called The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias. And I have a newsletter called Dear Good People that's a monthly look at these issues. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I guess, yeah, I'll go next. My name is Lillie Lainoff. I am an author. My debut novel, One for All, is coming out in winter 2022 from Strauss and Giroux. It is a gender-bent retelling of The Three Musketeers with a main character with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is the condition that I have. And it is also inspired by my 16 plus years of competitive fencing. And I'm also the founder and creator of Disabled Kidlit Writers, which is a group for middle grade writers, YA writers, picture book writers. We're all disabled, as just a group to talk about the process of publishing. We have authors from pretty much every stage in their careers, authors who are just starting off writing. We've got New York Times bestsellers. It's a very wide-ranging group, and we just hit over 200 members. So yeah, and I wasn't really expecting that, but it's very exciting. I'm also, I will be at least, a MA candidate in creative writing prose fiction at the University of East Anglia, starting in a week and a half.
Oh.
Yes, and thank you so much for having me.
Great.
Hello, I'm Kishonna Gray. I'm so honored to be here with you amazing human beings. I'm really excited. I'm so inspired by the work that you all do. I am an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Chicago in gender and women's studies and communication. So my work is in like video games and how to make basically gaming like more accessible and better for especially marginalized folks, but for everybody like in general. Just had a recent book come out, Intersectional Tech. Yay! Dolly just got it right there. Yay! Oh, y'all.
Like you and everyone else. Sorry.
Yay! Oh, y'all are so awesome. I appreciate you all. So, those are just like stories from the margins. A lot of the stories that we don't often get. From a queer lens, a disabled lens, a Black masculinity lens. So these are just some stories that I think needed to be told, and just to show the industry that there are a lot of us here in the space. So that's me. Glad to be here. Thank you.
And I am Courtney Craven. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of caniplaythat.com, the largest and somehow fastest growing website for disabled gamers. And we're a learning hub for game developers also. I'm a fiction writer. That's kind of got a pin in it while I do gaming work and editor-in-chief stuff. But yeah. So we are going to start off with some definitions, just so that everybody viewing has kind of a level playing field to know what we're talking about, where we're coming from, and we decided to kind of divide definitions up by who does what. So first one up is equality and equity. What are they? What are the differences? And you sure I think you were going to take that one? You
Muted. Yeah.
This is what happens when you get really excited about something. You're just talking to the void. Yeah, and actually, if any of you want to weigh in as well, I certainly want to hear your understandings of it. The idea being that everybody is. It seems to me, and just in the morning the meeting I had this morning as well, there was some confusion actually across borders. Lillie as well. It was part of the meeting was with some UK people, and they insisted on using the term equality. And so we here in the US, we're really interested in that because we've been pushing for the use of the term equity. And what I've seemed to understand is that equity is really about making sure that everybody starts on the same footing. So in other words, we have a lot of retroactive work to do in order to make sure that everybody can start for the same footing. Whereas equality is about making sure that everybody has the same opportunities, right? But you can't have the same opportunities without actually having the same footing to start on, right? So there is still some debate about whether we should use one term or the other, but I prefer to use the term equity. So I would love to hear from the rest of you about how you feel about that.
I think that's a good overview. Thank you for, saying that. I know I often, run into like issues like with folks, talking about where if we're doing equity work, then there's going to be some populations of people, some groups of people who may receive more in any given moment, right? To like catch them up. So I think, really to like breaking that down into like its simplest parts, I love using it's the unequal opportunity race. Like if anybody is like, if you're on the internet or nearby, go to YouTube and look up the unequal opportunity race. It really, it talks about specifically about racial identity, but I think it's very like applicable to like other identities. When you have a population of people who have had a head start for a long time, and when things were created for them and by them, that population of people didn't have to think about, okay, can these other people fit into this thing that we've created? And I think that's like the moment that we're in now, the moments that we've always been in, right? Trying to figure out how we can get racial minorities, to get more access and more opportunities. So I think it absolutely makes sense in a way that you framed it.
Yeah, I also appreciate how you framed it. I think that, my first introduction to the difference between the terms was the one disability studies course that was offered at the time in my undergrad. And it was taught by, I believe she was a doctoral candidate in anthropology, Elizabeth Miles. But my favorite cartoon that she showed us was these side-by-sides of like how equality and equity are different. And I don't know if you search like equality and equity on Google cartoon, it should come up. And it's very applicable to what we're talking about in terms of it for people who don't have access to the cartoon. It's three people watching a baseball game from outside of the furthest fence. And there's one very tall person, one medium-sized person, one shorter person. And equality definition is everybody is standing on a box that's the same exact size that lets them see over the fence so they can see the ball game. Whereas equity is the shortest person gets the largest box, and then on and on and scale. That way everybody is at the same height at the end, so they can all see the baseball game at the same height. Whereas with equality, somebody is still going to be much taller and much higher up.
Yeah.
Than the other people.
I love that, Lillie. And there's I don't know if you've seen, there's a sort of spin-off version of that where the version with the different heights, instead of the people being different heights, they're the same height, but the ground is slanted.
Oh, yeah.
And it's meant to make the point that Kishonna was just making, that there's all these systemic inequalities that have led to it appearing like people are different heights. Height, of course, is just a metaphor here. It doesn't matter if people are actually different heights, but metaphorically, and that the thing that needs to be fixed is the slant in the ground, not the heights of the people via the stool. So it's interesting how that cartoon, which I just love that you brought that up, captures so many of the layers of the topics I think we're covering today.
Definitely. And I saw that same graphic being used this morning by way of describing equity versus diversity. So it was fascinating to see how, how these different things shake up, which illustrates the point why it's so important for us to agree on certain terms before we can move forward with anything. So
Absolutely. There's another radical version where they destroy the wall altogether. And I think that, like the wall's just like not even there. Yeah.
Burn it all down.
Right. Or the inclusion version would be like, why are they outside the wall? Why are they trying to look in? Come on.
All right. We're doing new graphics. This is a whole new panel.
You're all like the visual people. You do it.
Next up, we had diversity and inclusion. What are they and what are the differences?
This one, I don't have good working definitions, but I think when I think about like diversity and inclusion, I think about like the practices of like institutions trying to rectify, the exclusionary practices of not incorporating women or people of color or disabled folks or, like different populations of people, and, creating like inclusive like practices, what that means, I don't know. Like, so I'll give an example, like for instance, like in higher education, like at my institution, there's like a training for people. If we're going to hire, then we have to like acknowledge, there are some underrepresented populations, and we have to like make sure that we don't have biases in looking at somebody's like profile or where they're publishing. So those are different kinds of examples, like to create more inclusive like environments. But I think like for me, I'm gonna stop right there because I know the discussion's coming later. I know we're doing definitions, but I'm always thinking about they're always doing like this external work, but we never fix like the cultures and the environments and the climates that have led to us, prompted the discussion and the need for diversity and inclusion. So I'm going to leave the definitions to like other folks because I don't have good working definitions. I have a lot of critiques though.
Well, I'll jump in specifically on diversity because I hear this word misused so much. The misuse I often hear is we describe individuals as diverse. We'll say, Dolly's, I have a diverse professor this semester, Dolly Chugh. The reason that's a misuse of the word diverse or diversity is about a group. It's if you have a bowl of fruit and you only have apples, then you do not have a diverse bowl of fruit. But that apple in and of itself is neither diverse nor not diverse. If you have oranges and apples and grapes and pears and plums, you have a diverse bowl of fruit. And so we've gotten in this habit of calling some of the national conversation has gotten to the habit of describing diverse individuals. And the reason that's problematic, we're not nitpicking on English, it's problematic because it's normalizing a particular identity and then saying anything other than that is diversity, rather than noting that what we're talking about is within a group on any particular identity dimension, do we have variation in that group? So an all Black group can be considered a not diverse group. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say, oh, that's a diverse high school. And then you go, oh, really? Tell me about it. And they'll be like, well, it's all Black. And usually that's whispered. And that's a good example of how we don't use that word diversity. So diversity defines a group, not an individual.
Well, within your book, though, Dolly, too, you have a really good, for me, it's a great metaphor where you talk about diversity being the gateways and inclusion being the pathways that lead up to and beyond those gateways. And I love that thought, right? Because sometimes people think of diversity as being like, well, we're diverse, we've reached our quota and everything is great. But there's so much more work to be done on either side of that goal, right? So it's great to think about those two things together and not as discrete things, right?
Absolutely. I like that. Like if we look at like the Brady Bunch windows we have on this screen, we might describe this as a diverse group. And I think that's an accurate description, but it doesn't mean that we're an inclusive group. That depends on all these informal. So the gateway of getting invited to be at this roundtable, that's diversity. But whether or not we are listening to each other, crediting each other, giving each other good nonverbals, have each other's back, that's what we mean by inclusion. Or pathways to build off of the metaphor.
Next up, ableism. Lillie, do you want to speak on that?
Sure, I will speak to that. To put simply, ableism is discrimination against non-disabled people. And I use non-disabled people because I think that disability very much exists on a spectrum. And I think that's a conversation we can have, conversation I can talk about a lot or we can have later, but it's important to note that ableism can be broken down into, it's not just discrimination against physically disabled people or visibly disabled people. I think that there's this misunderstanding that people just assume that ableism is, a lack of ramps, a lack of wheelchair ramps. Whereas there are so many different pernicious ways that ableism has infected our society. It's in, for example, something that I was dealing with just the other day and dealing with in my undergrad, but the fact that, in order to get the accommodations that I needed for my housing, I was told that, I had to give up going into housing draw with my suite of friends, that I would just have to be put in whatever housing accommodated me. And I was like, no, that's not fair. I should be able to live with my friends and also be in a space that is safe for me. And that's very simple, to me at least. And so ableism, like I said, it's pernicious and it's sometimes subtle, sometimes it's overt. It's, concrete exclusions, as I mentioned before, like the lack of wheelchair ramps, not having an elevator, not having captioned text. But it's also in the way that we talk about disability, the way we talk about mental illness, the way we talk about neurodiversity, the way we talk about chronic illness, and even just the language that we use is very important. There are so many words that we take for granted in using today that have roots in eugenics and in ableism. I'm thinking particularly of words like crazy or moron. And a lot of these words, people say, oh, but it's okay because they mean something different now. And there's this weird term, I think it's called linguistic bleaching, which is the idea of like a word losing its meaning over time. And yes, I understand that words change meaning over time. However, when words are rooted in such hatred, that doesn't go away. It's different for meaning to be lost. Hatred doesn't just disappear.
Thank you.
Next up, othering. What is othering?
I think, so sorry, Dolly, were you going to chime in?
I was like, Kishonna?
Okay. I see othering as like the process of like attaching like stigma to something or somebody or some aspect like of a person's identity, right? And so it's not only that you apply like, the stigmatized like notion to like this person, it's then also then what you do subsequently, like to exclude them from spaces, to not allow them to be a part of like an apartment group, like to live with their friends, like in an apartment, you've deemed their identity as inferior in some way and devalued them. But I think that, it's very important, that we also attach match like what the action then becomes, that where we lead, we do the marginalization by not having ramps, not having captions, not having those kinds of things. And so we've othered and marginalized, those persons. We said, hey, you are not like us, you are different from us, and we're going to treat you as such. So I think it's like two parts. I always feel that othering, has like those two parts where we devalued an identity, and there's some actions where we can continue to further, that othering process.
Yeah, that's really spot on. And it reminds me of a conversation on Twitter that I had very briefly with Dr. Oni Black. I don't know if you all follow her or not. But we were talking about why implicit bias training doesn't work by itself, right? And a lot of that has to do with the consistent othering that we do of people's narratives, right? And my favorite example is like, we know everything about white people. We know when they get their periods. We know when they have irritable bowel syndrome. We know when they're shopping for car insurance or health insurance. But suddenly Cheerios has a biracial couple eating Cheerios, and everybody's like, oh, Black people eat Cheerios. What? Like, that's so weird. How is that possible? And then everybody's up in arms, and you're like, yes, Black people eat Cheerios because they Cheerios. It's Cheerios. So, what we need to do is normalize these narratives. But the flip side of that people don't talk about is that when you other, we don't just other. We automatically denigrate, as Kishonna was saying, right? It's like, it's not just like, oh, Ishan's something else. She's not quite white. She's something else, right? But she's not quite as good as white, right? So if we can do away with that hierarchy, then it might be okay to see our differences as being other, but we're not there yet, so that's not going to happen, We've got a long way to go, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's so important, that you using the language of hierarchy, because I think we don't ever you talk about that we've actively constructed putting people on top, and there's some people at the bottom, and then a lot of us are complicit in sustaining, that kind of structure. So we don't often think about, these kinds of hierarchies, but I think that's, whatever I try to do, this kind of work, with privileged bodies, especially when I talk, I often am in spaces with just all white people and trying to, it was when I was in Eastern Kentucky, that was really clear, especially the class designations. I'm like, okay, you poor white students, you're not at the top of the hierarchy. You still have some white privileges, but, you have that class designation that doesn't allow you, full access, to this population. So I think that seeing the hierarchies is a great way to also talk about this stuff.
And last up, we had engagement versus satisfaction.
Yeah, so I asked Courtney to include this one because I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it touches on something that is really critical to this conversation, and that related thing is psychological safety, right? We can be satisfied with the life that we live now, or in my case, I can be satisfied with my position in publishing. I ran a literary magazine. I really enjoyed it, but I wasn't 100% engaged at the end of the process because there was a sense of lack of urgency around addressing things like diversity in publishing, right? And making sure that the gatekeepers were just as diverse as the people who are reading the publication, right? So I wasn't fully engaged, right? And a lot of that had to do with whether or not I was feeling psychological safety around the people that populated that field, right? On a regular basis. So I just wanted to touch on it really briefly because being satisfied is like, boiling frog, water's getting hotter, I'm satisfied with this, right? But I'm not fully engaged with the boiling water, right? Like I'm not thrilled to be there. I don't feel like I can bring 100% of my frog self to the boiling water, right? So that's a really clunky metaphor, but I think you know what I'm getting at here. So we want people to be engaged, and that means bringing all of themselves along with all their baggage and, the home problems they may have because of the place they occupy in society. We want them all to feel like they belong, and that has to do with psychological safety. So.
One of my colleagues, Professor Nicholas Pierce, he uses an expression, if he's speaking to managers about how they lead their employees, he goes, oh, that person's quit, they just haven't told you yet. So I love that.
Okay, so now the statement of excuse me. I've done so much talking the last 3 days that I have no voice left. So the statement of the problem in publishing and industry, and we can all touch on this. For me, personally, it is a lack of accessibility and gatekeeping, which, Lillie, I'm so glad you brought that up because it's such an issue that I just block it out. So, so yeah, but yeah. ableism is a big issue for me.
Should I speak to that? Can I speak to that? Or I was going to say, I think that, and it's an issue that we talk a lot about in disabled kidlit writers, especially for the writers who are querying agents or the writers who are on submission to publishers. It's very, very difficult to prove to agents and editors that your book is marketable when they haven't taken on disabled books by disabled writers with disabled main characters in the past. So, I mean, for example, when I was out on submission with One for All, I would say about 50% of the responses I got were, love this, love the writing. We don't know if there's readership. We don't know if it's marketable. We don't know how to market it. You market it like a book because it's a book. But that's besides the point. The point is that, as we talked about gatekeepers, if there are so few books published year after year, it's just going to take such a long time where we can get to the point where a disabled writer doesn't have to prove their writing's worth or marketability to an agent or an editor. And it's also a huge problem because there's so few disabled agents and editors to begin with. If you look at the manuscript wish list, which, by the way, I don't want to take issue with the manuscript wish list form. It's wonderful. I love the fact that it makes things more accessible for a lot of writers. But I mean, if you just go and you look to see how many editors or agents request disabled main characters, I mean, I think that there were 3 editors out of all the editors that were in manuscript wish list that were looking for young adult books that had requested disabled main characters when I was on submission. And one of those editors, Melissa Warden, was the editor who I ended up with. And she totally gets it. And I'm in the best editing relationship I've ever been in because, you know, I have an editor who really cares about disability and representation. But I mean, that's not the case for everybody.
I want to, if we can, I want to unpack some of what you've said there, Lillie, because that's some powerful stuff. So you're talking about, I guess we would need to talk about like the whole like structure behind publishing, right? So we have authors, right? We have the content that like the authors might write about or talk about. And then we also have like the industry that's like driving some of that, you know, the people, you know, the recruiting process, the selling and the marketing process. I was recently like made aware of, I guess, like the tensions in some of these things, right? So so especially with children's literature.
Right.
And somebody, you know, a friend was telling me that they may have like diverse content like inside books, but the people who are writing them are not always diverse. And it's always these people who are like speaking about other people's like experiences that get like access, you know, to these spaces more. So like white authors telling Black and brown stories or abled people telling disabled like stories. And those people get access more so than like the people who are like us, like in these bodies. And that was wild to me, you know, but I think, you know, it just goes back to like a lot of this part, you know, where you're talking about like the gatekeeper and also the networks, who has buy-in, who are the people who are already there that can get the access to the books and to get like the publishing contracts. And it's hard like for us to like to get into those spaces. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood the different parts that's even like involved in like publishing and just how tough all those like layers actually are.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was a good breakdown.
I agree. That was a really good breakdown. And in my experience, I feel like I'm on the flip side of this. Like I have a book contract with HarperCollins and now a book contract with Simon & Schuster. And I'm 100% sure it has to do, thank you, but I'm 100% sure it has to do with the networks I'm in and the access that gave me to agents and the introductions it gave me to agents. I didn't have an easy time getting an agent because they didn't like my book idea, but I had a very easy time getting meetings with agents and getting agents to say, you know, we don't like your book idea, but we like you, so let's keep talking. So that was actually profoundly easy. You're on mute, Kishonna, if you just said something, I missed it.
I'm just saying very interesting. No.
Okay. All right. So I absolutely concur that those networks are a barrier. There's one interesting tension or irony in all of this, which is, I don't know if this has been everyone else's experiences with books, but my experience has been that even with the big 5 publishers, they're pretty clear that unless you're coming in as, John Grisham or someone, that they're expecting you to do the lion's share of the marketing of the book. And that in fact, when they're offering a book contract, it's based, I'm making up these numbers, but 50% off of the book and the writing and 50% off of your platform, your following, your ability to sort of hustle and self-market. And definitely has been my experience, even with very supportive publisher, very supportive editor, that the vast majority of the marketing in the book fell on me or on publicists that I paid out of my advance. And I say all that to say, so when someone says something like what Lillie was saying, echoing what she's heard from publishers, that I don't know if it's marketable, I almost feel like that should be like, well, I do know it's marketable and I can market it. And I have a following, I have this organization, I have this Twitter following. Like that in my mind is sort of underweighting it's like there's a little bit, I love the people I work with in publishing, but I feel like sometimes they talk out of both sides of their mouth.
It's a disconnect.
Yeah,
It's a disconnect. That's right. Because we have massive platforms and followers, and we're like, hey, it's no problem to market the book.
Yeah, I got it.
That's why I feel like they're saying something else. It's not like a traditional, maybe it's not traditional pathways for them. I'm thinking about Courtney, and you may know some of this. Like I'm thinking about like in gaming, where like it's hard. Like there was a whole entire generations where it was hard for them to like put women in games as like the main character. They wouldn't make a woman as a hero. Then they wouldn't bring like people of color. He said, well, we can't sell them. And Laura Croft is one of like the top selling like characters like in games. So I feel like it's something that they don't want to do, and they don't want to say that. Well, they want to put the burden like off on us, and so you have to do all this work and do all this background work when in essence it's just their own biases just infiltrating like the process.
Yeah, and Kishonna, you've just said something really important. You've said that they don't want to do the work, right? And there's a couple of things. You all have said so much that I really want to unpack here. When you've said that they don't want to do all the work, what they forget is how tiring it can be to be knocking on these doors again and again and again and be told no for something you can't change, right? I'm writing disability literature or disability or a disabled heroine, and nobody wants that. Well, how is that the author's fault? Right. It is the publisher's job to carve out that space and find the people who are going to be interested in doing that reading. Right. And then, the other part of it is, Dolly, you were talking about doing the marketing, right? And how important it is for an author to get out there and do the marketing. I got to tell you, that stuff is tiring. I published with a small press, and that first time, I think I traveled 26 weeks out of the year, just doing the marketing for it. And if you are disabled or if you're experiencing accessibility problems, how is that a sustainable schedule? It's not. Or let's even talk about, diversity from another angle, right? Let's talk about the finances of it, right? If you don't have the money to fly to 8 different cities like I did, and you don't have the kind of work schedule that supports that, how is that an equitable model? It isn't. That's not a thing that we can actually sustain at all in any way, shape, or form. I barely did it, and I was just dealing with a sick dog at home. I mean, people have children and they're working 2 different jobs. It's not possible, right? So the success barometer then becomes much narrower, doesn't it? Is that an apt metaphor? I think I'm mixing my metaphors. Anyway, moving on. But yeah, I think that what you all said is so important, and this idea too of white authors writing the Black and brown voices, or abled authors writing the disabled voices. That's a thing that it's historic, right? And the question is whether or not we want literature to carry that responsibility of maybe just, I don't know, maybe not allowing people to, and I'm phrasing it this way because this is the argument that I would get, right? why aren't I allowed to write this voice, right? I'm writing fiction. Why can't I stretch a little bit, right? And that's something that you have to take a hard look at. Why are you writing the story? Why does it matter to you? Are you reading other authors who work in this field already, you know? So these are all things that we have to kind of consider. And I think this is part of the statement of the problem, right? This idea that we have all of these gigantic issues that exist in publishing when it comes to accessibility and inclusion. Now we need to know what is it about the field that we can kind of target and fix, right? So Lillie, your first question, for instance, was you mentioned that there was a lack of disabled agents and editors, right?
Right.
I mean, I think it is what we have to work with, right? This is the satisfaction part of it. Now the question is, why aren't the existing authors and agents who abled or majority white or whichever, why aren't they interested in hearing more stories from other people? That's the thing that always gets me. Why aren't you more curious? Why aren't you more curious? That's kind of where I get hung up on this.
Right. And I think that a lot of it stems from there are a lot of narratives that are traditional disability narratives, like if we want to talk about inspiration porn, or if we want to talk about sicklet in particular. I remember there was one agent on Twitter who on Manuscript Wishlist had said, oh, stories about main characters who are chronically ill aren't for me. I don't want sicklet. And then that turned into the whole thing of, well, sicklet is is a monster genre mashup Frankenstein sort of thing that won't go away because
can you define it, Lillie?
Yes,
for people
sure. Sicklet is the romanticization of chronically ill or terminally ill characters. So I'm trying not to name titles, but I think that there are a lot. Like, for example, just one that's not in my genre is Me Before You. And there's one example, I think that the one book with disabled main characters that's been on the New York Times bestseller list for YA for, I wanted to say it was on for over 40 weeks, for the past year, was written by an abled author. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult when these narratives are the ones that are pushed, and it's like, oh, so sad, or oh, so heartwarming. No, I'm sorry. I think that it's, and I wrote about this in an article a long time ago for the Washington Post about the short-lived Red Band Society, which was only on air for a year, and it was again it was sicklit, but for TV. And this idea of, oh, look at these sick kids, running around the hospital despite the fact they're going through chemo and, have CF. And it's this idea of, our lives aren't romantic. Do we deserve to see ourselves in a romantic light? Yes. But the way that we romanticize conditions and illnesses and symptoms, that's the problem.
I am learning so much from you, Lillie. Thank you.
Same. And I wonder, how do we get beyond that? Because I always, think about even I have two kids, and when I read these books that are often required, the schools require them to read books, and especially whenever they they have Black characters in them. All the kids are from the hood and from the projects, and they pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and then they get out of the projects. That's the narrative, like you said. That's first off, assuming that something's wrong with our neighborhoods that we're living in, and that we have to escape from them. So how do we fix that? How do we change that narrative? And again, I think that goes back to, what I was saying, that there's something that these institutions are wanting that is just so incongruent with what our desires and, what we actually want to engage in. So how do we push them and move them beyond that?
Right. So I think that there's lots of different levels. And if we go level by level of the entire publishing / reading industry. So if we go from, I don't want to call readers bottom to top, because readers are the bedrock, they are the foundation of the industry. But readers can specifically buy books by disabled authors. They can tell their friends and their family about books by disabled authors. Word of mouth is really important. and just continuing to buy the books that reinforce the authentic narratives that we need. Also calling on publishing houses. I mean, Twitter is such a great resource. I hear so many people complain about Twitter and how, it's ruining society. This is like one of the most accessible forms of communication that we have right now. And it's one of the only ways that people can actually call on major corporations and publishing houses, for instance, when they need to ask for representation. So you can call on with that. Disabled writers, disabled writers are writing our stories. That's not an issue. It's more about just giving them a lot of the time it's fellowship money, financial needs, since so many disabled writers are in need of that money, especially because of especially in America, given with Social Security, but that's a completely different issue. Agents can take on more disabled clients. They can encourage their current clients to not write disabled main characters who fall into the inspiration porn narratives or the super crip narratives or the sicklet narratives. And they can take a good long look at their current list, and see how many authors they have are disabled. And obviously, again, there is always the issue with nobody should have to disclose their disability. So that presents another issue. But I'd like to think that, there should at least be, a certain number of disabled authors who are open about their disabilities. Having authors who aren't disclosing their disability, they're bonus disabled authors. Like, we all count. Great. For editors, it's taking on more books by disabled authors, not really taking the answer of, well, we don't know how to market this as a rule. It's not taking on books that promote narratives, such as also for IP projects. So the book in question that I was talking about earlier was an IP project by a debut non-disabled author. And I think
IP is,
and I get confused by this too. IP projects are they're projects that are not developed by the writer. The writer writes the projects, but an editor might say, "Oh, I want a book that is this, this, and this, and I'm going to write up this list of characters, and this is how I want the book to go."
okay.
And it's a really great way for writers who are fast writers to make a living, and that's really important. It's also projects like the movie tie-ins, so like the Loki book or anything that was a movie first and then it became a book is usually.
So this is book packaging, right? So you would see it in the Sweet Valley High suite or the
Right.
suite, or okay.
Right, exactly. So the important thing is, if there is a movie about disabled characters, you hire a disabled writer to write the book.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, and to be more specific, you hire an own voices disabled author to write the book specifically, because that's an opportunity for that author and for that community in particular within the disabled community that author might not get because of how ableism has affected the industry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, two things, Lillie. You mentioned that editors and agents have a play in this too, and one of the things that really makes me nuts, because it's just a half step further from where we are now, is editors and agents standing up and voicing the idea that they're looking for X, Y, and Z. Right. One of the things we did at our literary magazine was to say that we're specifically looking for Black and brown voices, and then we went to historically Black colleges and universities at their MFA programs and put out a special call, and said, we're looking for your students' voices. Period. Right. We made it very, very clear, and that's what your editor did. Right. So to the point of non-disclosure, it's kind of like, you have made yourself open to this, and you have specifically said you're asking for this. That will move the needle in one way or another. Right. And then Courtney, I wanted to actually ask you if you would share your experience with the narrative that you're working on now, the fiction piece that has kind of gone away at this point about Susan, and some of the feedback that you got on that, because I think that's a really interesting lesson to be learned here, right? I mean, if you would talk about that, that would be great.
Yeah. My MFA thesis project was loosely based on my relationship with my significant other. And so it was kind of a romantic type thing, and then it transitioned at the end of the book into caregiving. And the feedback that I got over and over from most agents that rejected me was, this relationship is not believable. Or it's, one person called it icky, which I'm going to be mad about that forever. Calling
Right to be.
romance with a disabled person icky is what? But yeah, the feedback that I got was, this is, first of all, it's not relatable. This is not how I imagine this would go. Which, if anyone's ever done caregiving, you hate each other just as much as you love each other. Like, you have your moments, right? So there was a lot of that in the book, and the feedback was, okay, well, we love this, but we don't like this. We don't like the disabled part. We don't like it where you're still, pursuing her. You shouldn't sleep with the poor disabled woman, And so I kind of gave up on it because it's such a personal story to me. And I'm stubborn, so I'm not going to change the story. And it's such a personal story to me that I'm not going to change any aspect of it because it reflects my existence. And I know I had sensitivity readers for it, and I know it reflects their existences too. So, and this comes back to, there isn't enough representation in the other side of publishing, in the editors and agents. And speaking to what you were talking about, how do we fix it? For me, I think I like to call it the brute force method, which is kind of what I've done with Can I Play That? What Kishonna, I'm sure you know of her work, Tanya DePass, with I Need Diverse Games. And I feel like both of our approaches were, okay, this is what we need in games, you're not giving it to us, so we're going to do it ourselves. And we both did. Both organizations are hugely successful, and we made what we wanted to see in the industry, and I think that it's going to take a similar approach in publishing and literature.
I have a question about that. First of all, I'm so sorry that it's one thing to have work rejected, but it's another thing to have your experience invalidated. And I feel like the latter is really painful, and I'm sorry. I have a question about what you just said about, like, in the video game industry, you kind of are you're creating the disruption because it's not going to come from within. What I keep hearing, at least on the nonfiction side of the publishing industry, is like, why are we even bothering with the big publishing houses? Like, the people who are going out, like, if we're doing the promotion on our own anyway, like, this is the most stark version of what I've heard is, are they basically just a, like, paper printing factory? Like, is that what you're commissioning? Now, that's not my personal experience. Like, I have gotten far more value. Like, my book is definitely a better book for my editor's contribution. So I'm not representing my own experience, but it is what I'm hearing from a lot of nonfiction writers. It's like just self-published, and you'll have a faster book, a better book, and you'll control the process. You won't have to live with a title you don't like. You won't have to live with a cover you don't like, and you can still get the benefit. You can hire an editor to help you with your book. So I'm curious if that's because we're all sitting in different publishing spaces. I'm curious if that's what you're hearing, because that to me sounds like a version of, well, let's just do this on our own.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people do get fed up with the process. They do get fed up with being told, essentially, you're not enough. You're not good enough to sell, not not good enough, your identity is not going to sell. The identity of your characters is not going to sell. So I think when people get sick enough of it, they do turn to self-publishing. And I know that's what I have done. I don't really pitch anymore because I got tired of being rejected because, oh, this topic is not really marketable. Well, okay, I'll show you otherwise. So, but yeah, I do. I think they're very similar.
Go ahead. Sorry, Kishonna. One thing I'm wondering is, should self-publishing not be the backup plan, but the first plan? I mean, that's not the route I went, but Kishonna, I'm very curious what you were about to say.
I had a similar experience, and apologies if my internet is unstable. Let me know, and I'll repeat what I say.
Good.
So my book was published by LSU Press. Now I had, and this is academic publishing, so just so the audience, you're aware that's not literary publishing. Academic publishing is another beast into itself, right? So there are hierarchies and tiers of like academic publishing. So people have basically told me that LSU Press is a low tier publisher, right? And they said, I had all kind of people, Kishonna, why didn't you publish it with NYU Press or Duke Press, Illinois Press, like, places like traditional outlets for this kind of work, like from game studies or, cultural studies. And I had to tell them that all those places said no. I had the list, I had a mentor that sent me a list and said, Kishonna, these places will love your book. None of them loved it. They all said no, right? And I think that, it goes to like your point where, I didn't want to fight to be in those spaces if they didn't want me there, So that's why, when LSU Press, said they love it, and I was like, okay, that's great. But this book, and there's another point, that book that you all are holding right now, 5 years ago would have never been published. It was only just these moments that we're in that people are like, oh, we need more of these stories. We need Black stories, So, and I know it sucks, but maybe we have to just go with the flows of what's happening. Okay, Blackness is cool now. Black Lives Matter is cool now. Let me publish this book and get out what I can, And that sucks. That's unfortunate. But I think that's like part of the reality. There's going to be a moment like, oh, disabled narrators, these are cool. It's a hot topic now. Let's do these. And it's unfortunate that we have to be subject to that kind of like marketing pattern of like what's popping and what's hot. When our story should always matter. So I think that I just accepted the fact, and I'm salty now because I have these publishers reaching out to me like, Kishonna, hey, you got another book project? Like, not for you, baby. I don't.
Lost that opportunity.
Absolutely. And I have a situation now. I have a book that's under contract with NYU Press, and I'm actually thinking about like pulling it. And then people are like, no, you don't do that. That's career suicide, especially with NYU Press. But I'm like, they never wanted me looking to that. So we have to like engage like with those feelings like as well. I'm salty.
Right. So yes, as somebody who was also very salty and very stubborn, and I was going to say, Courtney, I had a very similar experience to you just in workshops in general. Mm-hmm. I had one story, actually the story that I won the LA Review Award for short fiction for 2019, and it was my first publication, my first fiction publication. And it was a story that had been rejected who knows how many times. And when I workshopped it in my undergraduate class, and it was a story about a disabled young woman telling various different suitors in her life that she's disabled. I had a classmate call her repulsive. And I think that, yes, like the word icky, the word repulsive, these words that have so much weight and hate and, have been used for so many years about disabled people. I mean, ugly laws were still around, well into the 20th century. For those watching who don't know, there were laws on the books that prevented people with visible physical disabilities or deformants from being on city streets. And it was supposedly, to reduce the amount of panhandling and begging, but really it was just oh, you're disabled, we want you to be, put away somewhere where people don't have to look at you or see you. And I think the last law, it was around in the 70s or 80s. But I think that the other issue when it comes from coming from a kidlit perspective, self-publishing just really isn't viable because you don't get into the Scholastic Book Fair. You don't get into the school libraries. You don't get invited to the school, book events, the virtual events. There's so many things that you get shut out of. Like, you don't get to go to the book cons. You don't get to go to all these different things. And, middle school, for example, I'm not a middle grade author, but middle grade is such a short window of time in terms of, in where those kids get their books. And the Scholastic Book Fair is just, huge deal. Yeah. And I mean, there's no way that you can be, like, you have to have connections that you get through being traditionally published.
Lillie was bringing up a really good point, which has to do primarily with distribution, right? And this is really the bottleneck. And in fact, when the COVID crisis happened, what am I calling it now? Pandemic crisis? I don't know. Like, in the after, we're going to say in the after. But when the whole thing started to crash, one of the biggest things to fail was distribution for comic books, for instance, right? And that whole industry is, I don't know where it is right now, but I remember reading this and thinking, oh my gosh, all of this hinges on the capability of comics books to be distributed, right? And when they don't get distributed, right, and that's the way it happens with small press books or with self-publishing books, if you don't have that distribution power, if you publish just with Ingram or if you publish just with Amazon, then you're only distributed on a certain amounts of platforms, and then your book has no reach, So it's really a choice between who has eyeballs on your books and who has accessibility to your books, right? Speaking of accessibility. So yeah, it's a problem.
That's
a problem. Yeah.
And I think that probably the children's and young adult genres are probably where that issue is most significant, as you just described it.
Yeah.
It's helpful.
Absolutely. Courtney, do you want to do the raffle?
Ooh. Yes, there's an ambulance going by. Right?
Oh, it's perfect time.
Turn it off. I will do the raffle. It's like, woo!
Okay, so I actually am drawing from a hat, okay? We have prizes. It's very exciting. Should have brought a hat with a deeper crown. Oh God, somebody fell out of the basket. Okay, all right, here we go. All righty, who have we got here? This is super high tech. I thought we'd go analog today. Oh my gosh, it's Shaylin Zanotti. Yay, good job, Shay. We'll be in touch. Awesome. I happen to know for a fact that Shay already has copies of my most recent book and Dolly's book. So Shay has decided that she is going to pass it on to somebody else, which is always a really, really, really good thing. So I know.
Go Shay.
Yeah, exactly. And I know she's super excited about Kishonna's book and about the anthology that Lillie is part of. So it's good stuff. Alrighty.
So do we want to get into our questions and how we solve these problems now?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right, let me find them. Okay. Yeah, we'll just go down the list. And this is something that I've talked about with Kelly Davio before?
Davio, yeah.
Davio. How do we sell accessibility? Like, how do we make people think that it's worth their time and worth their money? Which is, it's basically what I spend my professional life doing, trying to sell accessibility. And I've had success only very recently with Dolly and Shun. Like, outside of games, they were the first people that actually cared about it and were just like, oh, there's more I can do. Okay, tell me more. But outside of that, and especially coming from my MFA program, the overwhelming feeling is, okay, well, that's just more work for me to do, and I don't have any disabled people in my audience anyway. And it's just like, you're never gonna now. So...
Well, it's also just, it's a flat out lie. I mean, 20% of the American population is disabled. That's the funniest thing. I mean, I remember people telling me, oh, you're the first person I know who's disabled, or who, oh, honey, no. I promise you, have you only met 5 people before in your entire life? If so, then yes, maybe I am the only disabled person that you know. But if not, I promise you, your audience includes disabled people, whether you know it does or not.
Yeah, definitely. My husband was involved in an event whereby a team of blind cyclists tandem rode their bicycles across the United States. And they did it by way of showing people that blind people can, or people who are low vision can do anything, right? They told me 75% of low vision people are unemployed in the United States. That is unacceptable. I mean, we have to be better about making sure that we see these people, right? We have to be sure that we're better about truly being inclusive, not only in our business networks, but also in our social networks, right? And I think it's just, I suppose numbers is probably the easiest way to do it, right? Making the business case. But there is a moral imperative for us to do this. There is a moral imperative for those of us who are able to share the platform, or to even broaden our own lives, by way of reaching out to people that we may not have been able to reach before.
I think one of the concerns that I have is that, selling these stories and these narratives, it comes from a deficit model already, right? Mm-hmm. We have to prove our worth. We have to prove our existences. We have to prove why we matter. And I think like for instance, think about any other white cis hetero able body narrative. We're not sold those things. We're told that this is what we need, this is what we want, this is what we need to desire, right? And those things have just been ingrained and embedded in culture automatically, right? This is the default narrative. And I think that's why it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how we have to fix the cultures that are trying to do this work. There are so many conversations that we have to have, so I think that's where we have to push back on these editors and these people who are the gatekeepers, and make them even reframe their thinking around it. We just got to ask different questions, and we have to say things differently. I wish I could go back to those folks and say, is it gonna, how many dead black bodies is it going to take for you to think that this work matters? Then they'll be well, I don't actually need that. I think we have to ask those different kinds of questions to make them for them to be prompted to even think differently about this stuff.
The euphemism culture is a real problem. I was talking to somebody earlier this morning, and they were talking about how their donor base is a traditional population who, doesn't necessarily hold with the organization getting more political. And I was like, do you mean older white in the upper income bracket who, doesn't want to see other people? Because if you mean that, then let's say it. If we identify me as Asian and Kishonna as black and Lillie is disabled and Courtney is queer, okay, why are we not identifying these white people as white, right? It is what it is. So just call it, put a label on it. We know what that's like.
Yeah, one of the things that's, it's interesting because the first part of our discussion was about how do we, what are the barriers to diverse voices in publishing? And now when we talk about accessibility, it's what are the barriers to bringing diverse readers is part of that to the stories. And to me, those two questions are so connected. Because I've more and more come to the conclusion that while I am a social scientist, what's really going to change people's minds is not data and science, but stories. And so it's this chicken egg thing, because I do think, how do we create more accessibility? We bring more diverse voices into the storytelling, and humanize and de-otherize, and that will, I know I'm right now I'm talking about the long-term plan, not the they hit it hard plan, but that in and of itself will change the narrative, just having different stories out there. Look at what Hamilton did to a narrative. I wonder, there's never one cause and one effect, but does 2020 racial reckoning happen without Hamilton? Whatever problems there may be with Hamilton itself, it still sort of planted a lot of seeds. And I wonder if there's something similar here, that we need a breakout humanizing story to drive both greater representation and greater accessibility.
Which is happening, right? I mean, I would argue that George Floyd is very much a humanizing story, right? And Breonna Taylor and all the people that went before. So, I think for me, it's just a matter of whether or not our eyes are open wide enough to see these stories, right? I'm watching this, or I have finished watching and want to watch it again. This really great, I think it's a British series called Undercover. And it's about an upper middle class Black couple who's the husband happens to have been an undercover cop for like the last 20 years, and the wife doesn't know it. And she is a top barrister and is becoming the director of public prosecutions, the first ever Black director of public prosecutions. It's great. But that story encompasses everything from the problems with their marriage to the problems with their autistic child, to the fact that they were involved in an uprising that caused them to land in jail, right? And that narrative is so inclusive of all the things that Black lives are about, that when I finished watching it, I was like, where have these been all my life? Like, why, oh, and Dolly, will you tell your story about the radio station? And about that, Dolly has an amazing story about the radio station that I want you all to hear, because it's just all about, how lucky some of us are, right, to stumble across things like Uncovered or Undercover or the thing that Dolly's going to tell you about now.
Well, I mean, this is a funny little story of when I was a kid. So to date myself, I was a kid like in the 70s, and my parents had a clock radio, and then they decided to get a new clock radio that had like 2 alarms. So I got the hand-me-down clock radio, and that was like my first radio of my own, and so I got to like play with the music, and so I was so excited. It was one of those dial ones that I must have like dialed too far at the end of remember how it used to be like FM all the way across, and it broke. So then the dial like wouldn't move. It was just broken at the very, very end. And I think it was 107.5 if my memory fades, but it was whatever the last. So that in the New York area was WBLS, which is the big Black radio station in the New York area. Now, I'm not Black. I'm the child of Indian immigrants. I grew up in a very white town, in a very brown family. Those were the things I had exposure to growing up. But I didn't know one radio station from another. I just listened to this radio station every single morning when I woke up and every single night when I went to bed, and that was the radio station I knew. And what I didn't realize is I was being exposed to Black music and to Black voices and to Black talk. It wasn't super talky, but there was some talk and a range of perspectives. And so without intending to, it became clear to me that the Black experience in America is a diverse experience, it's a rich experience, it's a joyful experience, that there's all of these things that come with the Black experience. And it did eventually, as I got older, so I think we're talking roughly 4th, 5th, 6th grade, I started to realize I knew songs like kids in my school didn't know, or the kids I knew in my school. I knew of news events that my parents didn't know about. Like, there was just different conversations taking place. And while eventually, I got a not broken radio, and I think I got a boom box for Christmas, if you must know. And so eventually I sort of wasn't listening to WBLS on a daily basis, though I did continue to listen to it. I think now, at age 52, I feel like a lot of seeds were planted in sort of understanding what I do and don't know about the Black experience that wouldn't have been planted if I hadn't had that funny little broken clock radio.
I think this is the point is like, we have to do better than me just stumbling across Undercover. We have to do better than Dolly being destructive with her parents' clock radio. We have to be better than this, so we have to be intentional, right, about seeking out other people's narratives. And I will tell you a secret. I'm being very passive aggressive about my front yard library. I'm only stocking it with minority narratives. So nobody else has it. People go in and they'll drop off like James Patterson, and I just take it out and I like my bookshelf. I'm a terrible person, but it's so much fun. It's great.
I don't know. You like James Patterson, but
Oh no, it's the other way around. I just don't want it in that library.
I got you. Gotcha. Wink, wink.
There's plenty of other places for him, right? So Courtney is doing she's noticing that there's a time check going on here, and I know that we probably all have to go. So I'm going to turn it over to the captain and let her decide what to do. I'm totally putting her on the spot right now. But before we do that, before she has to say anything, I'm going to draw another name from a hat because Kishonna and I are going to give away another book.
I'm happy to too.
Ooh, okay, so we'll do another bundle?
Yeah.
We're excited. Okay,
Don't
great.
leave me out.
Okay. Allison Wolcott. Wait. Terrific. Okay, excellent. Great. Terrific. Thank you. Courtney, over to you.
All right. So that said, we are out of time. We're going to wrap up, and we will be back with part 2, where we tell you how to fix all of your problems publishing in literature